There you are again. I never thought the two of us would meet again. In case you weren't aware, the Souls-like genre is quite popular right now and has been for the past few years. And it being a genre I quite enjoy, I figured I would make a review for one of the newest and most promising games that fits into it, Mortal Shell. This game flew heavily under the radar for me, as I'm sure it did for many others. I saw the announcement trailer when it was released a few months ago, but other than that, I really hadn't heard much about it. The trailer looked promising, but wasn't a lot to go on for me. I wasn't necessarily sold on the game, as many other Souls-likes had come and gone without really being anything that I felt was worth my time. Then back in July, a beta was released, and I thought I'd give it a try. I had a fair amount of problems with the game, but I figured by the time the game came out, many of the problems would have been dealt with. Otherwise, what's the point in having a beta? What got me really worried was that it got a release date of about a month after the beta. I knew I still wanted to get the game and play through it, but I really didn't think that was enough time to fix lots of the issues, especially for an indie studio. Just as a brief disclaimer, I love indie studios and always want to support them. I recognize how difficult it is to make a game and release it with a small, not super well funded studio. I am aware that indie studios generally have a harder time with bugs and fixing issues than larger studios, so they tend to be more present. In this video, I want viewers to be aware that if I say anything in reference to the fact that Cold Symmetry is an indie studio, it is not to shit on them as a company. It is to point out the fact that some of the issues I may have with the game are not the fault of the developers, but due to their lack of resources in comparison to larger companies. Please support indie studios. When the game came out, however, I was extremely impressed by it. A large amount of the problems I had in the beta had been dealt with, or I had gotten used to them and didn't find as much of a problem in the full release. The game felt much more solid and honestly quite close to the quality I would expect from a AAA studio. This is not to say that I don't have issues with the game, it just happened to be a lot better than I had expected given the impression I got from the beta. I want to start off with one of Mortal Shell's most important and defining mechanics, hardening. Hardening is easily one of my favorite things about the game. It is such a creative mix-up to the standard gameplay loop of the Souls-like genre. Allowing the player to interrupt enemy attacks and pause their own as both an offensive and defensive tool is incredible. It allows players to fix their mistakes and have a mini reset in the middle of combat. The only issue I have with hardening is that in New Game Plus, the player takes damage if hardening is broken from enemy attacks. I felt like this kind of ruined the point of having it be a mechanic that the player is meant to rely on. I don't know what else to say about it, other than that I really like it, and that learning how to use it properly can make a huge impact on the flow of gameplay and player enjoyment. Another key mechanic is, as the title suggests, the use of different shells. This is where I'll be getting into spoiler territory, so if you don't want spoilers, either skip to the end to hear my final verdict, or come back and watch this video at a later date. The player can inhabit 4 different shells that can be found scattered throughout the world, or they could choose to play without using a shell, which means a one-hit kill from almost every enemy in the game and not being able to take advantage of shell abilities. Each shell has its own unique abilities, stats, and gameplay style associated with it. Harros the Vassal is focused on enhancing the hardening ability and taking advantage of it as much as possible, while holding the most balanced stat block with health, stamina, and resolve at all equal levels. Solomon the Scholar is focused on boosting resolve gain and resolve abilities, like parries and weapon abilities, while having the most resolve of the shells. Teal the Acolyte focuses on quick movement and poisoning enemies, but he has the lowest health in the game to make up for having the most stamina and maneuverability. Lastly, Eredrim the Venerable is about physical strength in both damage and defense, which is balanced out by having the lowest stamina. Overall, I really like the idea of having different shells to choose between and having to find the one that fits your gameplay style the best. But I feel like they could have done a better job making them feel unique. Teal and Eredrim have very different styles, with one being quick and dodge based, while the other is more about tanking through hits to put out high damage. But Harros and Solomon just feel a little underdeveloped. I think they could have made Harros actually get unique moves that he could do with hardening, rather than just giving it some buffs when using him. With Solomon, they could have made his resolve focus actually buff attacks or parries to a greater extent with additional button presses, rather than it just being a slight boost to resolve gain. I don't think they are bad, I just think the developers could have given them a more defined style like the other two shells. I do really like the concept of shells though, and hope that in the future, if there is an expansion or a sequel, they can expand upon them further. The combat in Mortal Shell feels a little clunky, but unlike in other Souls-likes, I think it is more fitting. In a game that the player is a creature that can harden its body and inhabit shells of other people, I feel like it makes sense to have the player be a bit weightier, even though it may not have been intended. Even though it's a little clunky, it flows relatively well, especially with the ability to harden. Both player and enemy attacks for the most part have weight behind them, and aren't just weirdly floaty. Invincibility frames on rolls and dodges are a little high, which can make some encounters a little on the easy side. The timing on parries is a little wonky, but the parry mechanic works well enough, especially having 4 different empowered ripostes that can be used as follow-ups. The only real problem I have is that there's a lot of downtime in fights, and it's too easy for the player to just back off and heal or use hit and run strategies. Overall, the game has an enjoyable gameplay loop that keeps the player entertained. The weapons in the game were a highlight for me. As much as I wish there were more than 4, I like that every weapon had a unique style to it and felt different. Each one was balanced well and worked alongside the shells to create different playstyles. The hammer and chisel are fast with low damage and the ability to poison targets. The hollowed sword is versatile with average speed and damage. The scorching mace uses wide swinging, slower attacks that synchronize well with hardening. And lastly, my personal favorite, the Martyr's Blade, hits with slow, high-ranged cleaves, thrusts, and slams that stagger enemies easily. Then on top of that, each weapon has its own unique weapon abilities that help further define its identity and playstyle. What I also really like is that to unlock each weapon, other than the hollowed sword, the player must fight a boss wielding the weapon to earn the right to use it. I think this is an interesting change-up on how to gain weapons in games like this. This is me in editing because I forgot to mention the Ballista Zuko while recording, which I really like. I just wish it wasn't locked behind buying it from a merchant. I think that that's a bit dumb when it could be found in the game somewhere. I feel like the weapons of Mortal Shell are something that really sets it apart from other Souls-likes, simply by each having unique flair and all being viable. Probably the biggest issue that I have with Mortal Shell is that the healing system sucks. Instead of having a limited use item that refreshes at checkpoints, which has been proven to work well, they decide to have a farmable consumable as the main source of healing. This not only leads to the issue of the game being too easy by having the ability to infinitely farm healing items, but also makes the game super inaccessible to new players. Yes, welt caps take time to respawn at their pickup locations, but they are still able to be infinitely farmed if you are willing to wait an excruciating amount of time for them. Even so, welt caps only do a small heal over time, which is not ideal. And the reason this is bad for new players is that they are going to struggle with some of the harder areas and bosses, and if they just completely run out of healing, then they will probably just give up. Not having a limited use healing item like Estus Flasks means that players can run out of healing, and when they run out, they can't easily get more, making the game get continuously harder as players struggle. Which, I shouldn't even need to say, isn't good game design. There is also healing off of parries, which is fine, but leads me to another issue I have with the game. Although it's not entirely bad, I do draw issue with the way Resolve was handled. It works fine when it's used for weapon abilities, but when it comes to parries and kicking, I think it could be better. I do, however, think they made a good choice to have Resolve be something that is built up by attacking enemies. It encourages the player to fight in order to gain access to certain abilities. Where my problem comes, though, is that Resolve is needed to do things that it shouldn't be. I don't think Resolve should be required to parry or kick. I also don't think that the kick should be something that the player needs to upgrade to use. I think a better choice would have been to have Resolve be required to use empowered ripostes and an empowered kick, but there should have been a base weaker version of both that doesn't require Resolve. I feel like it would have given the player more choice in actions they could do in combat. The overall enemy and boss design in Mortal Shell is quite good. There isn't a huge number of different enemies in the game, and some are reused and reskinned in different areas, but I don't think any of the designs are really that unbearable. The imps and the 3 different types of wraiths can be annoying at times, but are still fine enough. Each area has enemies that fit the aesthetic of the environment and have unique movesets that need to be learned by the player. I guess other than maybe some more diversity, my only issue is that most enemies don't really have a greatly varied moveset. At most, they have 4 or 5 attacks, of which they tend to use the same 2 repeatedly. This is the same for bosses. Each boss has very few moves, which allows the player to get them in a bit of a loop unintentionally. And other than that, when it comes to the bosses in the game, I think they're about the same quality as the base enemies. The 4 main bosses have cool designs and can be somewhat challenging. The Grisha are fine as repeating mini-bosses. Hadern is a good fight all 4 times, and as I mentioned earlier, an interesting way to unlock weapons. The only boss that really sucks is the imp that is just a regular enemy, only a bit more aggressive and with a boss health bar. I think this is kind of dumb and lazy. The only other issues I have with the enemies and bosses are that the final boss has too much health, the Archer Harlequin's accuracy is a little ridiculous, and the twin Sword Knights don't really ever stop attacking. Most of the other issues that I do have with this part of the game come down to Cold Symmetry being an indie developer and not having as many resources. So I won't mention them because I don't think it's fair to fault a game based on things like that. One of the biggest determining factors when it comes to Souls-like games for most people is the difficulty. I found Mortal Shell to be easier than most Souls-likes. The few points where it was difficult seemed to be a bit more artificial than real difficulty, by having huge areas with a long run between checkpoints, or overloading the player with enemies to fight. To be honest though, I don't really care how difficult the game is. Yes, I like the rewarding punishment too, but I will never think that a game is bad because it's not as hard as I want it to be. Mortal Shell is difficult enough to still be fun and satisfying, and that's enough for me. As with most Souls-likes, the story is a minimal part of the experience, so I really didn't notice if it was good or bad because I honestly wasn't really paying attention in either of my 2 playthroughs. When it comes to NPCs, I think they were fine, but they could have done more to make them a part of the game. The last thing I want to talk about is the map and world design. I think the areas of the game all look really great and each have their own unique feel which separates them from each other. Fulgrim is, however, a little confusing to find your way through, especially because of its murky tones. I like what they were going for with it, but it could have been made a little clearer which way you are meant to go. I don't really have a huge amount of complaints for the Crypt of Martyrs or the Shrine of Ash. I think they were both fine enough and had plenty of secrets to explore. The Seed of Infinity is weird for me though. I like its design and aesthetic, but I didn't really feel like it fit with the rest of the game. It's strangely sci-fi, while the other areas are all very grimdark. It also had huge unnecessarily open areas, as well as areas with narrow paths that are crammed with enemies, making it way too easy to die to gravity. Then there was also the issue with having to run back through areas after defeating the bosses in the Fog World. It is interesting in concept, but it just ended up being really tedious and frustrating. The game is also a little short, but I don't think that's too much of an issue because it does have some replayability. I'm giving Mortal Shell a 7 out of 10. Also, I'm not IGN, so I want to remind you that 7 out of 10 is a good score. Not everything has to be an 8 or a 9 to mean it's good. I think Mortal Shell is a strong game that has a lot to offer and a lot to love, but it's not without its faults. It's a rewarding, enjoyable game, well worth your time, and I would highly recommend checking it out if you're into games of this style.